there! So the first thing you're going to notice is that I'm wearing a face mask. Because multitasking. I figure that if hundreds of fashion YouTubers can just wear this to, quote, review it, then I can read a book while wearing a face mask. If you're curious, this is the Grown Alchemist Botanical Beauty Deep Cleansing Facial Mask, Wheat Germ, Ginkgo, and Cranberry. And sure, I'll throw in a review tomorrow, because why not? It says to wear it for 10 to 20 minutes. Figure that's about how long it takes me to read to you guys. So, multitasking, bitches. Anyway, so today we jump into chapter 4. In our new normal, the unedited, direct-to-viewers version, now with extra face mask. So chapter 4, Expecting to Fly. Only the best pilots were assigned to fly the coveted Boston-Los Angeles route, and in May 1964, Freddie was on his first official flight as a professional pilot from Boston's Logan Airport to LAX. Less than 6 months after he'd applied for a spot in that year's first training class. What Freddie achieved in the cockpit made him unique in the Trump family. None of Fred's other children would accomplish so much entirely on their own. Mary Ann came closest, putting herself through law school in the early 1970s and over the course of 9 years, compiling a solid record as a prosecutor. Her eventual appointment to the Federal Appeals Court, however, was possible because Donald used his connections to do her a favor. For decades, Elizabeth worked in the same job at Chase Manhattan Bank that Fred had arranged for her. Donald was enabled from the beginning, every one of his projects funded and supported by Fred, and then by a myriad other enablers right up to the present. Other than a brief stint at a New York securities firm after graduating from college, Robert worked for Donald and then his father. Even Fred was not entirely self-made, since his mother had started the business that would become Trump Management. Freddie had put himself through flight school in college, defied his father, which he would spend the rest of his life paying for, and had no support from, as well as the active contempt of, his family. Obstacles aside, he had been determined to apply to TWA as many times as necessary. He made it on the first try. In the 1950s and 1960s, the vast majority of incoming pilots had received their training in the military. A typical training class had 20 students, 4 from the Air Force, 4 from the Navy, 4 from the Army, 4 from the Marines, and 4 civilians. At 25 years old, Freddie was one of the 12 men accepted into the airline's first 1964 pilot class. 10 of them had received their training in the military. When you consider that there were no flight simulators and all the training was done in the air, the achievement was all the more staggering. Freddie was finally reaping the rewards of all of those hours he'd logged at the airfield, while his fraternity brothers were partying. In those days, air travel was at the height of its glamour, and at the forefront of that trend was Howard Hughes's Trans World Airline. Oh, yeah. That's what TWA stands for. For everybody as young or younger, I will admit that I am, TWA, Trans World Airlines. Good to know. Anyway, the favorite of the Hollywood glitterati, TWA provided limousines to the gossip columnist Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons to ferry them to and from the airport. The resulting publicity made everyone want to fly TWA, one of the largest carriers in the world. TWA flew both domestic and international. The captain was God and treated accordingly, and thanks to Hughes' panache for beautiful women, the stewardesses all looked like movie stars. The reactions pilots got from the passengers as they walked through the terminal, the admiring stares, the requests for autographs were all new to Freddie and a welcome change from Trump management, where he had stressed and failed to gain respect. The gleaming airport stood in stark contrast to the dark, unwelcoming office and dirty construction sites he'd left behind in New York. In place of bulldozers and backhoes, rows of 707s and DC-8s glimmered on the tarmac. Instead of having all his decisions second-guessed and criticized by his father on the flight deck, Freddie had the controls. Freddie moved his young family to Marblehead, a small harbor town 40 minutes northeast of Boston's Logan Airport on the Massachusetts coast. They rented a ramshackle cottage set amongst an eclectic mix of houses that circled the village green not far from the sprawling harbor, where Freddie kept his yacht, a beat-up Boston whaler. May in Marblehead was idyllic. Freddie loved the flying. There was a lot of socializing with barbecues and deep-sea fishing excursions. Almost every weekend, friends came up from New York to visit them. After a month, though, Freddie started to struggle with the schedule. He was often at loose ends when he wasn't in a cockpit. Linda noticed that he started drinking more than everyone else, something that had never been a problem before. Her husband didn't confide in Linda anymore, wanting perhaps to shield her. So she wasn't privy to the details of the conversation he'd had with Fred back in December. Linda didn't know about the constant barrage of abuse Freddie was receiving from his father in New York through letters and phone calls, but his friends knew. Freddie told them, with a note of disbelief in his voice, that the old man was embarrassed to have a bus driver in the sky for a son. It didn't take much for his father to convince him that choosing to leave Trump management meant choosing failure. The most crucial thing that Linda didn't fully grasp, and to be fair, Freddie probably didn't grasp it either, was how much Fred Trump's opinion mattered to his son. One night, after returning from his most recent rotation, Freddie seemed particularly on edge. Over dinner, he said, "We need to get a divorce." Linda was shocked. Her husband was under more stress than usual, but she thought it might be the result of his being responsible for the lives of more than 200 people every time he flew. "Freddie, what are you talking about?" "It's not working out, Linda. I don't see how we can keep going." "You're not even here half the time," she said, mystified by his outburst. "We have a baby. How can you say that?" Freddie stood up and poured himself a drink. "Forget it," he said, and left the room. They never renewed the conversation, and after a few days, they continued on as though nothing unusual had happened. In June, Donald, then 18 and freshly graduated from the military academy. Is anyone else disappointed that we're leaving Freddie's story to talk more about Donald? I am so tired of this man. I know it's a book all about Donald Trump, but I don't want to hear about him. Like at all. In June, Donald, then 18 and freshly graduated from the military academy, and Robert, 16, still a student at Freddie's alma mater, St. Paul's, drove up to Marblehead for a visit, arriving in Donald's new sports car, a high school graduation present from his parents, a step up from the luggage Freddie had received when he had graduated college. Freddie was anxious about seeing them. None of his siblings had ever been up in a plane with him or expressed any interest in his new career. He hoped that maybe, if he could let his brothers into his world, he'd find an ally. Having even one person in his family who believed in him might bolster his waning strength to withstand his father's disapproval. At the time of the visit, Donald was at a crossroads. When Freddie had announced he was stepping away from Trump management in December 1963, Donald had been caught flat-footed. His father's decision had come at the end of the first semester of Donald's senior year, and since his name wasn't Fred, he had no idea what his future role in the company might be, although he did plan to work there in some capacity. Because of that uncertainty, he hadn't adequately prepared for his future beyond high school. When he graduated from New York Military Academy that spring, he had not yet been accepted into college. He asked Mary Ann to help him find a spot at a local school when he got back home. Freddie and Linda had a barbecue for lunch, during which Donald told them he was going to Chicago with their dad to help, in quotes, him with the development he was considering. Freddie's relief was palpable. Maybe Fred was beginning to accept the new reality and had decided to take Donald on as his heir apparent. Later in the afternoon, Freddie took the boys out on his, quote, yacht to do some fishing. This woman's overuse of quotation marks. Yet again. Chapter 4, you strike again. Despite Freddie's best attempts to teach his brother the basics of the sport, Donald had never gotten the hang of it. Donald had been at NYMA the last time they'd been on a boat together, along with Billy and a couple of Freddie's fraternity brothers. When one of them had tried to show Donald how to hold the pole properly, Donald had pulled away and said, "I know what I'm doing." "Yeah, buddy, and you're doing it really badly." The rest of the guys had laughed. Donald had thrown his pole onto the deck and stalked off toward the bow. He had been so angry he wasn't paying attention to where he was walking, and Freddie had worried that he might walk right off the boat. Donald's fishing skills hadn't improved in the interim. When the three brothers returned from the harbor, Linda was preparing dinner. As soon as they came into the house, she could sense the tension. Something had shifted. Freddie's good mood had been replaced by a quiet, barely contained anger. Freddie didn't often lose his temper, not then, and she took it as a bad sign. He poured himself a drink. Another bad sign. Even before they sat down for dinner, Donald started in on his older brother. "You know, Dad's really sick of you wasting your life," he declared, as though he'd suddenly remembered why he was there. "I don't need you to tell me what Dad thinks," said Freddie, who already knew his father's opinion all too well. "He said he's embarrassed by you." "I don't get why you care," Freddie replied. "You want to work with Dad? Go ahead. I'm not interested." "Freddie," he said, "Dad's right about you. You're nothing but a glorified bus driver." Donald may not have understood the origin of their father's contempt for Freddie and his decisions to become a professional pilot, but he had the bully's unerring instinct for finding the most effective way to undermine an adversary. Freddie understood that his brother had been sent to deliver their father's message in person, or at least Donald had. But hearing Fred's belittling words come out of his little brother's mouth broke his spirit. I would have broken his little brother's face. Even wearing this god-awful mask on. I'm sorry, guys. Linda overheard the exchange and came into the living room from the kitchen in time to see Freddie's face drained of all colors. She slammed the plate she was holding onto the table and screamed at her brother-in-law. "You should just keep your mouth shut, Donald. Do you know how hard he's had to work? You have no idea what you're talking about." Freddie didn't speak to either of his brothers for the remainder of the night, and they left for New York the next morning, a day earlier than planned. Freddie's drinking worsened. In July, TWA offered him a promotion. The airline wanted to send him to their facility in Kansas City to train him on the new 727s it was introducing to the fleet. Just to back up for a second, you guys know what's happening in Kansas City right now, right? It's not the same as what's going on in Portland, but it's the same as what's going on in Portland. I very strongly recommend that you take a look at what's going on. And if you hear anybody that is a little less educated, let's say, trying to excuse the behavior, the idea here is yeah, they wouldn't have minded the help if they didn't find out through a press briefing. But, that's neither here nor there. He declined, even though Linda reminded him that he never would have disregarded an order from one of his superiors in the National Guard. He told management that having signed a year-long lease for a furnished house in Marblehead only 2 months earlier, he couldn't justify uprooting his young family again. In truth, Freddie had begun to suspect that his dream was coming to an end. He was losing hope that his father would accept him as a professional pilot, and without that acceptance, he probably couldn't continue. He had spent his entire life up until he had left Trump management trying his best to overcome the person his father wanted him to be. When those attempts had repeatedly ended in failure, he had hoped that in the course of fulfilling his own dream that his father would come to accept him for who he really was. He had spent his childhood navigating the minefield of his father's conditional acceptance, and he knew all too well that there was only one way to receive it, by being someone he wasn't, and he would never be able to pull that one off. His father's approval still mattered more than anything else. Fred was, and always had been, the ultimate arbiter of his children's worth, which is why, even late into his 70s, my Aunt Mary Ann continued to yearn for her long-dead father's praise. When TWA later offered Freddie the opportunity to fly out of Idlewood, he jumped at the chance, thinking it might be a way to salvage the situation. The move made no sense from a practical perspective, since he'd have to commute from Marblehead to New York every 3 to 4 days. Worse, it put him into closer proximity to Fred. But maybe for Freddie that was the point. Even if he couldn't get Fred's approval, it might be easier to convince his father that flying was what he should be doing if he could see it up close. In between flights, Freddie took fellow pilots back to the house to meet his family, hoping Fred might be impressed. It was a desperate move, but Freddie was desperate. In the end, it made no difference. Freddie could never get past the betrayal. Oh, Fred could never get past the betrayal. Very important. We can't be mistaking Fred for Freddie or Frederic. Although Freddie had joined ROTC in a fraternity in the flying club, things his father would have disdained but probably didn't know about, those activities hadn't altered his plan to work for his father to ensure that the empire would survive in perpetuity. From Fred's perspective, Freddie's leaving Trump management must have felt like an act of blatant disrespect. Ironically, it was the kind of boldness Fred had wanted to instill in his son, but it had been squandered on the wrong ambition. Instead, Fred felt that Freddie's unprecedented move undermined his authority to diminish Fred's sense that he was in control of everything, including the course of his son's life. A few weeks after the boys' visit, a summer storm thundered over Marblehead Harbor. Linda was standing in the living room ironing Freddie's white uniform shirts when the phone rang. As soon as she heard her husband's voice, she knew something was wrong. He had quit his job at TWA, he told her. The three of them needed to move back to New York as soon as possible. Linda was stunned. That Freddie would give up everything he'd worked for only 4 months made no sense at all. In fact, TWA had given him an ultimatum. If he resigned, he could keep his license. Otherwise, they'd be forced to fire him as a result of his serious alcohol problem. If Freddie got fired, he'd likely never be able to fly again. He chose option 1, and with that, their life in Marblehead was over. Just after Labor Day, the three of them moved back to the corner apartment on the 9th floor of the Highlander in Jamaica. But Freddie hadn't entirely given up on a flying career. Maybe, he thought, if he started with smaller airlines with smaller planes and shorter, less stressful routes, he could work his way back up. While Linda and Fritz settled in, Freddie went to Utica, a small city in upstate New York, to work for Piedmont Airlines, which flew commuter routes in the Northeast. That job lasted less than a month. He moved to Oklahoma and flew for another local airline. He was there when Fritz celebrated his 2nd birthday. By December, he was back in Queens. His drinking was out of control, and he knew that he could no longer hack it as a pilot. The only self-made man in the family, Freddie was being slowly, inexorably dismantled. Less than a year after it had begun, Freddie's flying career was over. With no other options, he found himself standing in front of his father, who sat in his usual spot on the love seat in the library while his oldest son asked for a job that he didn't want and Fred didn't think he could do. Fred reluctantly agreed, making it clear that he was doing his son a favor. And then one more glimmer of hope emerged. In February 1965, Fred acquired the site of Steeplechase Park, one of 3 iconic amusement parks in Coney Island that had been in operation since around the turn of the 20th century. Steeplechase had outlived its 2 rivals by decades. Dreamland had been destroyed by a fire in 1911, and Luna Park, also struck by fires, had closed in 1944. Fred owned a building complex and shopping area named after Luna Park, not far from the original site. Steeplechase continued operations until 1964. The Tilly family had owned the park from the beginning, but several factors, including high crime and increasing competition for entertainment dollars, had persuaded them to sell the property. Fred, who had known that Steeplechase might become available for development, set his sights on its acquisition. The plan would be another residential development in the style of Trump Village, but a significant hurdle would need to be overcome: changing current zoning laws from public use to private construction while he waited for the opportunity to present itself. Fred began to lobby his old cronies for their support and started drafting his proposal. He dangled the possibility of Freddie's involvement in the ambitious project, and his oldest son, frantic to improve his position and put TWA behind him, jumped at the opportunity. He suspected it might be his last chance to prove himself to the old man. By then, Linda was 6 months pregnant with me. All right, guys. Well, it's been fun. Oh, this gets clear. Weird. Huh. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Like I said, I will be reviewing this tomorrow, because why not? And as an FYI, we are done with part 1 and chapter 4. Goodbye. Stay sane. Avoid the news if you can. See you tomorrow.